So, balance of payment structures, really important. They are going to form the basis behind our government macro objective, but also possibly an argument to be had with regards to protectionist policies that there might be. We also need to understand that countries will change over time, and this is something that we discussed with our UK history here, where they were specialising in the production of one particular product, but over time all of sorts of things changed in the market, but also in the actual extraction of the resource itself. It was oil, and that meant that they were now no longer able to import that product like they were, or export that product like they were, and possibly become a net importer of the product. Again, here is the data. So this is breaking the balance of trade, which tends to be the one that provides us with our deficits in a lot of countries at any rate. And it's broken it up into the different types of goods. Right? Now, obviously not every type of good. This is for the UK. It is 80 to 2004, so not hugely recent. We've got semi-manufactured goods, crude oil, food, beverages and tobacco, and this big one here, finished manufactured goods. And that's where we see, right, the deficit really hitting there. Okay? The imbalance in the trade there. So it is that type of good. So you can actually break it down to which goods are having the major impact in the accounts. Which goods, which industries, which regions will be having an effect. Right, now, it is important that we use the right terminologies. Okay, so we're thinking about demand side and supply side, right? Just as we did with economic growth, okay, when we looked at that. Demand side causes of a trade deficit to do with economic growth. So when there is economic growth and it continues on, right? So we've got countries like Australia, America that have had basic decade-length periods of very strong economic growth. That will lead to an increase in demand for all inputs, right? So that's derived demand, okay? And it will also lead to an increase in growth in consumer spending, which is the standard of living approach. So UK consumers, because this is the UK, have had a high marginal propensity to import, right? Their standards of living were at a certain level, their incomes, and based on that, they are going to be importing a whole lot more products. We can also think about the demand side from an exchange rate point of view. Now, we haven't gotten into the exchange rate much yet. We will. Don't panic, it will be coming. If we have what's called a strong exchange rate, okay, then we're going to see some economic effects that will occur that are going to cause us potentially to have a trade deficit. And one of those is price competitiveness for exporters. If the exchange rate is strong, and we're going to discuss what that means when we look at the exchange rate, when the exchange rate is strong, it means exporters are not going to be price competitive, so we're going to lose that income, potentially, the sales and income from our exports. By reducing those profits, the incentives as well. Right, told me to restart the computer if I need to. Then that's going to have, an effect on our trade deficit. Imports might appear relatively cheap or cheaper because of the exchange rate. All right, again. And we will look at the exchange rate and the effects of it and the supply and demand shifts, etc. We will talk about how it works, how other economic effects can impact on the exchange rate. We're also going to talk about how some countries might deliberately manipulate their exchange rate, and by doing so they might make it the opposite way round so that their exports are relatively competitive in comparison to other countries. And by doing that, they're actually going to give themselves an unfair advantage. That's a protectionist policy. So that's all on the demand side, okay? Right, causing a trade... Yeah, hello?
Mr. David, could you explain the first point again, the sustained and strong real GDP growth and how that leads to an increased demand for inputs?
Yes, absolutely. It's straight out of the playbook for economic growth, right? The more income the domestic consumers have, the more demand there is for all goods, and that includes imports, right? So those imports are going to come into the country, okay, and quite often they will be goods and, finished goods and services, but they might also be raw materials used in the production of other goods and services in country. I was going to say New Zealand. In the country that are being demanded again. Yeah. So if we demand more, let's say cars, if we demand more cars, then we need the parts to produce the cars, and some of the parts that we use to produce the parts are actually imported, like things like semiconductors.
Oh, thank you. Wait, but I'm confused because so an increase in GDP, a real GDP, can cause an increase in imports due to everyone having more money to spend on imports. But then, if everything is CP, an increase in imports could also decrease real GDP, right?
Yes. Yes, you're absolutely right. The increase in import payments is an outflow. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So it's going to be one of those sort of balancing acts that the accountants will do, right? And also you've got the time frame issue, right? What's happening immediately, the increase in growth, the increase in income, the increase in spending. Then there's an effect later on that sees the outflow of money for import payments, but is that bigger or less than the other effects that are going on at the time? And it's all happening at the same time. Everything impacts on everything else. It's one of those reasons why students tend to favour microeconomics over macro, because of this very fact, right? It's why I like macroeconomics over microeconomics, because everything impacts on everything else, and that's the way my brain works. All right, it's that idea. Sorry.
No, I was just agreeing.
It's a very holistic sort of view of the entire economy. Everything is connected. All of the theories that you learn, all of the policies that the government implements, they're going to potentially have a ripple effect that's going to affect everything. And it will change. It will continually change, right? You think you're at this point, but then you're at the next point. There's also the lag with the collection of data. So we figure out where economic growth is, but we're figuring out where economic growth is a quarter ago or 2 quarters ago. So, yeah. All you need to do now is to just explain what demand-side causes of a trade deficit are. What is it all about? All right, it's talking about the demand side of the economy. So how might that cause a trade deficit? There you go. All right, so demand side. So we're thinking about aggregate demand. Right, some answers coming in. Good. Yes. Yes, well done. That's a very good way of explaining it. Yes, sure have. Well done. Well, that's good, Arena. Yep, okay. So it's one of those things where you hear people who are politicians making an argument that says the trade deficit is bad and these countries and we've got all this trade deficit, and then you've got to understand that there's a big demand side component to this. It's the people in the country demanding these products, and it's their standard of living, right, that is allowing them to demand these products. So the fact that they have the trade deficit at all simply suggests that they are experiencing quite a high standard of living. Right? I'm not saying for everybody, but certainly for a number. So go on. Yes? Okay. Yeah. All right. Now, okay, now I just want to wait, there's a couple more to have a go, so last couple for last couple. I think there's duplicates of a couple of you, so maybe, right, we'll move on, because I think that's just the duplicates. We also need to consider the fact that there is a strong supply side possible cause to any trade deficits. Right? So if we consider the infrastructure, right, in an economy, when you have grown your economy and you've moved to that sort of more privatized end, the free market end, it might be that there are inefficiencies that have been created. It might be that there is insufficient capacity in a certain industry because of the fact that the market isn't necessarily going to be able to provide that. So, for example, the classic case in New Zealand is electricity. The government has to quite regularly prompt the electricity industry. The government has in the past actually owned the electricity industry in New Zealand. And it's a difficult industry for profit margins to be earned. So there is quite often suggestions about insufficient capacity, right? Okay, and as a result of that, then you are going to need to import, potentially, the capital goods, the machinery, the supply infrastructure, those raw materials for that particular infrastructure. There could be a research and development gap, okay, so things along the lines where you are needing to import basically technology, you are needing to import the latest machinery, right? You're not producing it domestically, you can't figure out how to produce it, the other country can, so from a supply point of view, you just can't produce it. Yeah? One of the arguments that used to be done in America was about how on earth could America produce iPhones. And one of the arguments we used to say was that, yes, theoretically America does have the capability to do the chips and put them all in and all of those. They don't have all of the raw materials. There's some raw materials that are actually not in America for the iPhone, so they would have to import those. But the actual know-how they probably have, but what they don't have is the capacity. Right? They can't ramp up the production high enough to be able to produce enough products to satisfy the demand. They would be able to make iPhones, but they would be expensive. Right? They would be, obviously just the wages of the people would be a whole lot more expensive. Sourcing some of that material from overseas would be very expensive, but also the lack of capacity in their factory size would mean that, they just couldn't produce enough of them. There would be a scarcity of them, right? A shortage in the supply, which would ramp up the prices. If you've been to China, you've probably seen, or in the documentaries, you will have seen the factories, and you've seen how big those factories actually are. And in other parts of the world as well. They're able to get those scale savings. Changing comparative advantage in the global economy, and that's the idea of a lower cost competition. Right? So again, it's that same argument that we're making. We need to import these products from other countries because they now have the comparative advantage in the production of them. We don't. Right? And that is, as the world has evolved, that is what has happened. All right? Okay. Now, I'm guessing that you know what's going to come next. What you need to then do is to do your best to explain how there could be supply side effects that would cause a trade deficit. So the aggregate supply side.
Mr. David, I have a question. Is a trade, would you count a trade deficit? No, hold on. Would you count a trade as in just good? Trade would be good. It's goods and services, right? So what you mentioned before, that when you who isn't a local to Malaysia came to Malaysia, it's technically a trade where Malaysia is technically importing you, right?
Yes. Yeah, it does get a bit confusing. I understand that. Remember, you've got in the overall structure, you've got the balance on goods, and you've also got a balance on services, and that's exports minus imports. So it's the income versus the payments for both of those. All right. So when we say trade deficit, we do typically talk about goods. But the trade deficit could be about services. You're absolutely right. Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Here we go. Got some answers coming in. Work, Andrew. Yes. Yeah, that's good, Arena. So anything that's going to have an impact on aggregate supply, okay, on the productive capacity in your economy. And it could be all sorts of different things. In New Zealand, productivity and education are always going to hold back the capacity of the New Zealand economy. Right? It has been a real concern. And the government has been desperately trying to take steps to improve productivity in New Zealand. Right, to the extent where they changed the entire educational assessment system in order to make it skills-based as opposed to content-based, so that they could direct learners to learn the skills as opposed to the content, because the content will change, but it's those key skills that they were wanting. And by doing that, it enabled the government, to break up education into bite-sized chunks and enabled them to award you for smaller units of learning in New Zealand, so smaller units of learning that were potentially very specific to particular areas. So a classic case in point, if it's economics, we're talking about you'd have a demand unit, you'd have a supply unit, you'd have a market model unit, and each one of them would have different accreditations, so different certifications from them. And then it's up to the employer to kind of look through the list and figure out what you're good at. Right? That was an attempt at improving the productivity level of New Zealand high school learners. It did have unintended consequences. It did, and it still does to this day. Right? One of the unintended consequences was by narrowing the education down into the bite-sized chunks, which is very gamification. That's very much what behavioural economics suggests is a good approach. But it does mean that you sometimes get to a more, I was going to use the word ridiculous, a more extreme approach from learning. Right? So for a student, if they know that they only need to learn this one little part, then it stops them from attempting to, reach further, right? To learn more, to, go outside of, the curriculum. Okay? And that was a real narrowing of what students actually were capable of. And when we met them at university, it became quite obvious that you had learners who had learnt, based on the New Zealand curriculum, and learners who had learnt based on a more international curriculum as to what, they had focused on. Because if you're going to be assessed on this one little thing, why would you learn other things? It kind of doesn't make sense. Yeah. So, and that's the approach the learners took. So, a classic example that I had was one of the units. It was one of the first units, one of the introduction units. And to pass this particular unit, it was 50-50, and it was a true or false question. And that's it. So they had to get one question right, and it was a true or false question, and that if they got that right, then they'd actually passed that particular unit. And when that sort of removes scholarship, that removes the critical thinking part, it removes your ability to, analyse and extrapolate on the information and dig deeper into the data and all of those sorts of things. And students were going, well, I don't need to do that, I can just tick the box and I'm done. And I'm not saying that other assessment models don't do similar things. I really aren't. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that other assessment models that are more rigorous and involved aren't necessarily approaching things maybe from a bit too difficult an angle. Yeah. But it did lead to unintended consequences. There are entire schools now in New Zealand, in fact quite a lot of them, who have abandoned entirely that first level of the New Zealand curriculum, assessment-wise. They're just not doing it because they don't see the point in doing it. All right? They've adopted an approach which says they're going to look at the second level and they're going to do it over 2 years, all right? Which makes more sense. Yeah? So there are a number of learners who did learn the first stage, and now their qualification kind of doesn't mean as much. Yeah? It's also very difficult. It became very difficult to try and translate what they were learning in New Zealand if they were looking overseas. What did it mean? Oh, was Sariha here? She was there and then she's not. All right, team. Here we go. Insufficient capacity, yes. Supply side issues, research and development, yes, absolutely. All of those things. Anything that's going to impact on the infrastructure, on the productivity levels, on the actual ability to produce, the productive capacity. anything that's going to impact on there is going to have a supply side effect on that trade deficit. So being able to split those two enables you to think a little bit deeper about the issue of trade deficits, whether they are good or bad, and how the government might be able to correct them. Because depending on which side you're looking at, so if you're looking at the demand side or the supply side, they're going to be different government policies. If you are desperate to correct a trade deficit, and the deficit has been caused by the demand side, that's a whole other kettle of fish from trade deficits caused by the supply side. There will be very different policies, potentially, for that side. Right, so we talk about trade and services, right? And this is something that Jensen mentioned. There's a lot of services, and in some parts of the world, they're huge. And we quite often forget that things like transport are a service. And you think about the countries that are these massive tankers with all the containers, these huge container ships traveling all around the world. That's a service. Okay. Insurance, banking, they're the ones that we normally think about. They're the ones where you think about Singapore and London. That's where you kind of see those. Data processing and information services. Now that can be different, right? Because you can actually export the data processing service. And I might have mentioned this to you before. I apologize if I have. I'm old and I forget things. Right? But at one point in New Zealand, when we had a mortgage, we had to change the mortgage. Right? And it was just changing a line or two within it. It wasn't a big deal. But because it's a legal contract, you had to go into the bank and sort all of that out. Right? Now, it took forever for the bank to sort this out. It was weeks and weeks. And one of the reasons when we worked it out, because we went into the bank and we had a meeting with them and said, why isn't this being sorted out? Why hasn't this happened yet? And one of the reasons why is because the bank didn't do any of the data processing in the actual bank itself. They outsourced it to Bangalore in India. All right? And so what they did was they would fax the information over to Bangalore in India, to the company there, and they would sit at their computers and type all the information in and then send it back, right, through the email. Okay. Problem with doing that is, of course, if there are any, confusion about words, and that's what was happening. They couldn't work out, believe it or not, it was issues to do with my name, all right, and my telephone number. Okay, there was issues to do with that, and it looked different on one record to another, and they were getting it confused, and so they kept sending this information back and forth. No, it's not right, send it back. No, it's not right, send it back. So it took about a month to get this change done. Right? So even services like data processing, information gathering, just the inputting of data can be outsourced. So it is possible that that is a service that will generate income, and obviously education as well, right? And thereby have an effect on your balance of trade, particularly balance of trade and services. This one is illustrating, again, it's old data, it finishes in 2005. It is the trade and services. This is the UK, and one of the things that you can do with this data is, obviously you can point out the dips that occur. You could perhaps have in a case study something that was going on at these points in time, right? And you can also point out the size, the amount. You could potentially do a comparison like a part of GDP sort of number. How big is this in comparison to the UK GDP? And you can then make some discussion about what sorts of services it is that the UK is exporting. And the case study will probably talk about it. And in the case of the UK, then a lot of it is to do with, yes, the financial services in particular, right? Consultancy, finance, insurance, all of those sorts of industries. So, so my brother-in-law works for a bank in the UK, but his entire team that works for him, they're in India. All right, so it's just him operating in London. The rest of his team are in India. All right, they were outsourced. So he's the actual only one who's working there. It's all banking, it's all insurance, it's all computers. I don't really understand, but that's what it all is. Right? So he does a lot of the work that tries to then liaise between London and India and other parts of the world as well. So there again, just as a different way to illustrate the same concept, but what we have done is we've split that trade balance for services up into different industries, into different markets. So there's travel, which I find quite interesting, transportation, communications, there's royalties and license fees, so those copyrights and trademarks, etc. Here you've got financial services, and that's where you see the income being generated. The travel idea here is quite clearly because the people in the UK are travelling elsewhere. Right?
Mr. David, sorry, another question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that like companies like typically like outsource like employees in like other countries.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they're in other countries, would that be considered like a quote unquote export import then?
That's a really good question. Let me see. Yes, it will in a way, because it depends on how they bill it, right? And they will have to pay for those services, so that will be an outflow of money, right? Then when the product comes potentially back to them, they're able then to sell the product to other people and maybe generate their own income from that. So yes, there will be aspects that will be export income, but there will be aspects that will also be imported from.
So like the employees working for a country, for a company in a different country, that's an import, but then when the goods come back to them, or the goods or services come back to them, they're then exporting it to somewhere else.
Potentially, yeah. As I say, it depends very much on how they've set up their cost and their billings. So it might be, I mean, typically it would be a separate company, a separate entity if they're outsourcing it, right? And all they're doing is just getting them to do that work, right? And then they receive the product from that, and then they are able to sell that wherever they need to sell it.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. The example I used of my brother-in-law is a little bit complicated because essentially what they are producing is computer code, right? And it's always difficult to think about what computer code actually is, right? And it travels around the world, and how do you bill for that sort of an idea? But they outsource to India, get some of the computer code built out there, comes back to the UK, it gets fixed or changed or tweaked or monitored in the UK, and then it goes out to the world from there.
I see.
All right. Nope, that's not you. That was last year's group. Right. So here's an overall view. UK exports and imports of different goods and services. And what you can do with this, as we see, is there's periods in time where exports were higher than imports, right, up until late 1990s, in which case imports then are above, right, exports. And we see you can work out the gap between at different years. You can work out the difference between them. Okay, based on the numbers. It is classified as what's called seasonally adjusted. So they're going to take out any seasonal variation that happens. They're also going to do it in constant prices. So if you like, real prices. So they're taking away any inflationary effect from it. and they are measuring it per quarter, right, which is also what you have found in the data that you looked at as well. Right, so if we look at the net trade there, right, similar idea, big gap between the trade in services and the trade in goods, and that is an increasing gap over time, right, and you can actually, again, work it out on the basis of GDP there. So I'm measured on the basis of GDP. Right, percentage impact of GDP. Here we go. Yep. That one I've always found quite an interesting one. This is from your investment account, right? So balance on investment, or balance on income. And what we see here is quite a dramatic, well, I mean, it looks quite dramatic because of the scale, impact on GDP based on investment. And the time period where there are big jumps is after the 1990s here. I mean, there's one big jump here, but after 1999 in particular, when the UK was more fully integrated to the European Union, and then there was a lot of investment flow, right, going around. Right? So that's the sort of idea that you could discuss with that one. This is going the other way. Having a look at the investment, the foreign direct investment. So here's the UK outward investment in blue, and UK inward investment in red. So in that context, you can work out the difference between the two. Right? How much is what is the difference between the two? Right? There's the balance there. So that's, I'm going to tell you, there's an interesting period of time there where they equal each other. So all you're doing is looking at different ways to represent the data from different aspects of the accounts, right, and trying to work out potentially what you could do with those. Right? So just working out how big those investments are, both in and out, so out and in, right, and why they are at those particular years and what possible implication that will have for their finances, their overall balance of payments. Transfers we talked about. Now again, if you look at from the 1990s on, when we see the UK moving more into Europe, you're probably likely to see that happening more and more. Right, of transfers going in the negative direction. There is a period of time here where there's a big spike into the positive direction. I actually have no idea what happened in 2001, but that would be quite an interesting analysis. That looks very much an outlier. All of a sudden in 2001 there was a big positive spike in net transfers. Quite an interesting one to think about. Right, so then if you were to compare, right, different countries, and this again is a really interesting study to do. If you have a look here, this is the UK and the US, and we're using as a measurement the percentage of GDP. Right, so the dotted line is the UK and the solid line is the US. Right, you probably very quickly notice that the UK has had quite a fluctuating current account balance over the time period, whereas the US has had a fairly steady, fairly stable, albeit declining, current account balance. You can look at individual time periods again and note, say, big changes. So here, so again, it's that late 90s period where the UK was joining the European Union, right? Now that's an important milestone sort of time period, as much as Brexit and obviously the flow-on effects from Brexit is also an important economic milestone sort of event. So you'll see effects like that, right, occurring with regards to Brexit over the next little while. How about that one? Exports and imports to and from China. The red line is imports from China, the blue line is exports. I know the scale makes it look, well, it's still dramatic, no matter how you look at it, right? But that's really big, right? Now, this is the sort of graph that our friend Don the Con would point to and go, look at that, yeah? But what's that is actually telling us is about the standard of living in the UK. Yeah? It's telling us about productive capacity in China as opposed to the UK. Right? It's telling us about productivity in China as opposed to the UK. And it's telling us about comparative advantage. Right? All of those things will be making up that rather dramatic curve. All right. I might show you one more. I think I've got one more. Yes, one more. All right. Just because I like this graph too. Just check that out. That's incredible. All right. Looking at it, this is billions of pounds per year. All right. And you look at those numbers. So that's billions of pounds per year. And this is only from 92 to 2005. That's with China. Again, you can make the leap that from about 1999, obviously the UK is more involved with Europe, but despite the fact that they are more involved with Europe, they're still heavily trading with China, right, which is what you'd expect. And the amounts, the sheer volume of that is just unreal. And if you look at those trade statistics for China, it's quite incredible. Right? You look at the volume of trade and the percentages of trade of specific products. Right? So if you were to look at how much of the world's toys are produced in China. I had a look at one of Harley's last night. Yes. And it was actually made in Vietnam, which was quite a change. I was surprised at that. You know, I was expecting it to be made in China, right? But it was actually made in Vietnam. Which suggests something about China and their growing middle class and the increasing costs of production, etc. in China, and that businesses are now moving their production facilities to other countries like Vietnam. Right, so we're going to finish it there. Okay, so you got that in the back of your brains. Right, now please review these concepts, have a think about balance of payment structures, have a look through the site, the InThink IB site, have a look through the revision materials that have been posted, and more will come. Do start revising also your microeconomics. Make sure you are keeping up with the revision, bite-sized chunks, a relatively regular revision program. For those of you going and getting vaccinated tomorrow, all the best. Please don't panic about it. It will all be okay. All right? But do drink plenty of water and take a painkiller if you need it. Take a pen and some ID. All right? You've got to prove who you are, usually. All right, team? So I will stop the